Hi everyone. Today I am talking to Bob MacLean. Bob is the assistant librarian for rare books in the archives and special collections of University of Glasgow Library. And I have known Bob now for years. I mean, mostly virtually, although we've met in
Yeah.
person as well. But through the magic of Twitter and social media. And one of the reasons that I'd hoped we could talk to you, Bob, is because I think of you as being a really fantastic advocate for special collections on social media. And I really love the way that you've used Twitter, that you've used blogging, that you've kind of brought um, rare books librarianship and kind of brought it to a much wider audience. So I hope that today we could find the secrets of your success.
That's
That's
very
all right.
kind of you.
So the first question I was going to ask really was about your own background and
Mm,
how you came to this role, how you became a librarian working with rare books.
yeah. I'm a very accidental librarian in lots of ways. I often laugh. I'm one of the least organised people, so I'm possibly not cut out for librarianship, and it's not something I saw myself going into. I've taken slightly unusual path into special collections and rare books world. I started off actually at Glasgow, studying my undergraduate degree in geography of all things. And that there was an opportunity there in my honours undergraduate year to come and have a look at some early printed books, old books, or what I thought of them as at the time. I don't know. They were Victorian pamphlets.
Oh,
Trying to
I
think.
mean, that's
Yeah,
journalism. That's recent.
so it's brand new stuff. But yeah, that was an amazing kind of transformative experience, and found this really interesting. So kind of those cliches that you hear about the books of kind of sensory things, so smell, touch, all of these sorts of things. So that's fascinating. So back in these days, you could get jobs in university libraries slightly more easily than you can now. And I managed to get a part-time, not a temporary contract as a library assistant, and became a cataloger for 6 months. This was like about 2002. 2001, I tell a lie. And I kind of have been at University of Glasgow Library ever since, starting off as a library assistant and slowly working my way up from the bottom through chance and pushing people down the stairs where I could. And then did a master's in librarianship part time while I was here. So that's kind of that's my route to doing this job. Very very fortunate now and difficult to reproduce, I'm afraid.
Of course, yeah, the time's changing, but good to,
Yeah.
to see that kind of that mix of learning on the job and growing in the job, but also then the formal study with the master's study as well. Um, I
Mm.
wanted to ask really about Twitter here because that's,
Yeah.
as I say, it's how we first met, and I know there's a devoted following for your tweets about special collections materials. How did you come to Twitter in the first place? Did you see it and think, "Oh, this is what I need as a librarian," or was it a little more organic than that?
I think I was a skeptic possibly at first, and I think I wasn't a really early adopter. I was looking at it. I think it's 2013 that I joined, and I can't remember exactly. I think someone else in Glasgow Archives and Special Collections possibly had joined first, and I thought I'll give it a try. But what I found and what I still believe is it's been hugely valuable kind of network to keep in touch with what people are doing, and that kind of liaison between a kind of archive and special collections librarian world and academia. It works much better on there than it possibly can in real life. And as a result, I think I sometimes keep in touch with academics in my own university more effectively through Twitter than I would through any of our internal communication structures. So it's a really good way of following conversations, seeing trends, finding out what people are doing in so the same as you and different from you. So it'd be quite useful to give you good ideas, but also kind of make you feel comfortable that the same anxieties and stresses that you have in your job are felt in others. So I found it really, really, really useful for me.
I think that's something a lot of people would recognize is the power of Twitter in particular, but other social media to create that kind of sense of academic community, both within an institution and then beyond it. I mean, I know so many people that I've worked with and that I've got to know at conferences and through research trips
Mm.
are people I initially met on Twitter. Um, And I want to dig into that a little bit more later on. But I was going to ask about kind of the use of special collections materials. So, 10 years ago, it was, of course, a very new idea that you might take materials for special collections and, snap some pictures of them and pop them online. I wondered
Yeah.
about how that became a part of maybe your Twitter persona or your Twitter strategy down the line.
Mm. Yeah, it certainly wasn't strategic for me. There's very little I fear that I do is strategic. And
I
what it
feel that
really, I
too, yeah.
suppose, it comes out of the reason that I work in the area I'm doing is I find it interesting and I want to talk to people about it and show people stuff. So it's as simple as that. So it's a kind of it was an organic kind of continuation of when people come and visit me in person, show them cool things that we've got in our collections. Well, how this is a really good way of doing it online. So I think I started doing blogging possibly first. I think we used WordPress before that for a slightly more kind of maybe longer form conversation type thing that you could have where you're presenting something in context, talking. Whereas Twitter initially were just discrete tweets I would do of, oh, look at this cool thing that I've been looking at today, kind of thing. And then that kind of grows into sometimes tweet threads, that kind of thing, or linking to other content. So yeah, that's kind of where it came from. Yeah.
I want to actually dig in a few minutes into the question of blogging because I think that's, for many of
Right.
us, I think that's where it all started, but also it
Sure.
still remains a really useful way of getting this content out there. But before we do that, um, I was going to ask about, over the years that you've been doing it, both personally and, then plugging in kind of institutionally as well. Um,
Mm.
what do you think, a good social media strategy for special collections can do? I mean, it can, of course, draw more attention to the materials you have. Maybe it can engage researchers or other groups. What can you achieve by kind of tweeting about this kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting. There are two different approaches you can take as an institution. You can try and I suppose link in with what's going on within your institution in terms of say research trends, important events and dates, these sorts of things, and try and plan it. Or you can try and be a little bit more off the cuff, irreverent, and try and kind of feed into popular culture a little bit more. I'm saying either or. I suppose if you have someone who's really committed to it, or enough people, you can do both to some extent. But certainly the easier is the former because you can actually divide out the work amongst a team and actually properly plan it out and say, okay, an important anniversary for our institution is coming up this year, or one aspect of our collection. Let's kind of look at that and draw attention to it. The problem I find, I think that's what we've done in our own institution, and a lot of places do. I think the problem with it is that it can sometimes end up a bit dry. It maybe isn't as engaging as the slightly more impromptu, reverent stuff. But yet it's probably the more effective way of showing your collection content off, if you see. So it's about maybe finding a balance between the two of being, off the cuff or a bit more kind of of the moment and planning out your work. But it certainly drives interest in your collections, either, if you can do it, which is great. And raises profile of what you're doing within your own institution, which I think is really important. If you can start to form connections with researchers, with your your comms office, that type of thing, and that, and when it's a bun fight for money everywhere these days, trying to raise your profile within your own institution is a really important thing to be doing. So that
I think a lot of people will recognize that, that idea of having to strike the balance between the kind of medium term strategy where you know what you're doing and you have a theme for, a given month or a week, or you're going to
yeah,
hit anniversaries and things like that, but also needing to have, those moments that are a bit more spontaneous, but that could potentially go viral or something like
yeah,
that, where you can really have fun. So striking that balance, I think, is really important. I was going to kind of delve a little more into that and ask about the lessons that you've learned in terms of tweeting effectively about special collections materials. So have you, over that time, come to think, the particular approaches, whether it's kind of, using hashtags like your Manuscript Monday or Flyleaf Friday or whatever, did they work
Yeah.
particularly well? Does it work well to focus on, particular kinds of document or material? I suppose, have you noticed trends over recent years in what tends to do well and how, what tends to be the most engaging kind of content?
I wish I could work it out. It seems to be a bit random, to be honest. Well, I mean, what I would say is that, and this is where the challenge is of trying to be really strategic about it, is that the things that work really well are the things that the person who's tweeting about it and writing about it is enthused by. I think if it's something that you find interesting and you're willing to do a massive long tweet thread delving into it, you quite often people will also find that interesting. Whereas if you're just trying to tick a box for it's an anniversary of X, Y, or Z, it becomes a bit dry and not that not that engaging. So it's a really tricky thing. And I think the balance, the problem that we have found with this within our institution is that trying to share out it's the labor involved in maintaining social media is really actually quite high. To do it well, it's probably a full-time job. I think that's the problem, and virtually no heritage institution that I know of has employed someone to do that as a full-time job. So it ends up being divvied out amongst a team of people who have lots of other demands on their time, and so you end up with this. You lose, maybe there's not a single voice, and so it ends up being a bit confused institutional events. So I suppose the lessons learned are sometimes the fewer people involved, the more coherent it might be. But what I would love to be able to convince the people who hold the purse strings is that this is actually an important job, and if recognised as such, it should be funded as such, and it should be made and I'm not talking just about my own institution. I think generally that's something that's a mistake that is made by a lot of places.
I think that's absolutely true. And yeah, as you say, institutionally, sometimes, and in, not just in special collections and not just in libraries. I think more broadly in academia, it's that kind of work that it's assumed, someone can pick that up in the slack time. Yeah. And that actually brings me on to the next question that I was going to ask, which was to kind of shift our focus a bit more to how tweeting and other kind of public engagement work around special collections fits institutionally. So you're someone who, when I was thinking of people I'd like to talk about public engagement, yours was a name that immediately came to me. But I was wondering, is public engagement something that has a place in your job description, for instance? Is your role assumed to be one that carries that responsibility, or is that kind of plugged in or stacked on top of the teetering pile of other responsibilities?
No, I mean, I think it probably didn't in the past, but we've had a restructure a couple of years ago. Our archives and our special collections are now part of the same institutional structure, and we kind of tried to break down silos by creating new teams across the two. So I'm now part of the public engagement team. So yes, the problem is what does engagement mean? I mean, it's pretty much anything and everything. And so from that point of view, it's still teetering pile of things. And what I have found personally is that the time I have given over to for just any kind of social media, whether that be blogging, particularly blogging, I suppose, but also Twitter, is far less. And it's really difficult then to create time in your when you're busy for that, to prioritize, I suppose, becomes more difficult. So I think it's a tricky balance to find. And I think part of the problem within institutions when it comes to funding this sort of activity is that trying to create an evidence base for its efficacy is really quite difficult. We know it's important. I think everyone accepts it's important, but how important is it, and how can you actually measure that, and therefore how can you fund it properly? That's the challenge, I think. And I think particularly, in times like at the moment with things like COVID, with also just cross-sectoral cuts going on, where money is quite difficult to find, there's a kind of a reversion to the core. You start to cut out the extra stuff and look back, well, what's our mission here? We're here possibly to serve our own institution primarily, and therefore something like social media, which is far more of a kind of outward-looking activity, is something that's more difficult to legitimately fund or throw extra money at. So it's a really difficult thing, and I haven't quite worked out how to to sell it. Yeah.
And I suppose that makes my potential next question quite unfair, because I was going to ask, how do we do it, right? How do we prove the value of this? But I think this is so much in our discussions of engagement and of impact. One of the things we're constantly coming back to, because there are a lot of very sometimes useful and sometimes very imperfect ways of measuring whether we call it engagement or impact with the content we create, with the events we put on and stuff like that. I don't know if you have any more reflections on proving that kind of, on helping an institution to draw the connection between successful social media work and more broadly success in public engagement.
The short answer is no. No, I'm not quite sure. I think what I've seen, you can see examples of when it's done well, but I think it's difficult to create templates for it. So, I mean, a really good example it would be if you look at something like this is quite a common well-known example now. It's the Museum of English Rural Life, a very a fairly peripheral bucolic museum at University of Reading, University Museum, that's social media through one member of staff who had a very engaging kind of Twitter style.
A unique voice, we might say.
Thousands and thousands of followers, going viral constantly with their by kind of just glossing their content in really irreverent ways. The two ways of looking at it are, well, does this really serve what the museum is about? Is it really on mission, if you like? And if you're looking at it in that narrow term, then probably not. I mean, and then you would never bother funding it or anything like that, or recognizing it. And yet, suddenly, he created this knowledge of this one small museum. So it's maybe slightly different, though, for museums than it is from an archive and special collections, I would argue, where museums have a kind of a mission of either clicks or footfall, that kind of thing, that you can measure your success and failure in. For an archive and special collection, it is slightly different in that it's not just a quantitative measure of success. There's something there about depth of support, and it is more inward focused. So you can't necessarily just look at that model and borrow it directly, I think, for a university kind of support service. But there are certain things we can do there. What I would argue there is what you can potentially do is, even if you start off with maybe something that's silly, your tone's maybe humorous, that kind of thing, that's not necessarily of less value in the longer term, because it creates connections, it gets people interested, and it can lead on to other things. It has that kind of that possibility of creating deeper connections that are more long lasting.
And I suppose there's this question of visibility as well, and engagement with the broader academic community. So I know it's absolutely through you that I'm aware of some of the richness of the Glasgow special collections. I remember we've had conversations about is it James Boswell's dad's learning Dutch, and there's all these kind of these great bits in the collections. It's absolutely magic. And I think I want to kind of beware of thinking of engagement as something that's just about a kind of a non-specific public. I think it's really important to think about improving the visibility of collections to, where, researchers kind of around the world can suddenly get a taste and get a glimpse. But also, you mentioned the Museum of English Rural Life, and that's a case of a really successful Twitter voice, but also a sense of a kind of the person behind it, as you say. And I think something that's really been valuable about the work that you do as well is that you create, you do create a voice. There's a way, as well as a, emailing an archives email address, for instance, people feel like they can engage kind of on somewhere like Twitter in a more informal manner. And I think that can potentially lead to really great collaboration and conversation as well. I mentioned there that question of voice, and that was one of the things I was thinking about in terms of I was going to say tips and tricks, but I'm also interested in pitfalls and challenges as well here. in terms of making public engagement work, so you've kind of mentioned a few of the strategies that can be used and kind of finding that balance between kind of the quirky and original, and the more kind of medium term strategized way of doing it. I don't know if you'd have, if someone was starting from scratch with, let's say someone's watching this who's in a position like yours, but at an institution that doesn't have a strong social media presence, would you have words of wisdom or potential words of warning for them in doing it?
Well, there's caution, I think. The caution is that the time involved is far greater than you might think. So I don't like to start with negative, but I suppose it's going in with your eyes open is important. If you're going to start something like this, you have to be aware that it does engage a lot of your time, and I think that there are responsibilities that we have when we do this sort of thing. So, for example, you want to maybe select your images, you're wanting to describe them properly. If you're going to link to your content, you have to make sure your catalog record's good enough. So there's time involved in that. You should always make sure that your things are accessible. So your content, you should always have alt text for in the images, that type of thing. That's time consuming, but it's important. So all of these sorts of things are time consuming. And then there's the time of actually replying to questions and things that are generated. So that's the kind of going in with your eyes open. It is important. What I would say though is that the upsides are also huge here, and there are all sorts of possibilities can be generated from this, and your profile will definitely raise accordingly. I suppose the big question really is just about what content you share and how you go about doing it. It's easier when it comes to things like voice, to have fewer people involved in it, because voice just becomes a more natural part, becomes what you present to yourself, and there is a bit more consistency there. For me, it's never been particularly overthought that. But clearly, the more people who are involved in maintaining content and contributing to a program, if you like, the more difficult it is to be consistent in that. And so there ends up being a kind of reversion to something that's slightly more anodyne, if you see, less personal, and it's just a natural thing. So there's a kind of it depends what side you want, what you want to take. Are you willing to put a lot of time and effort personally into doing it? It might be more successful than having something that loads of people are contributing to, I suppose.
I think it was really good that you mentioned that thing, the work of replying and engaging in conversations, because I think it's an easy misconception to think, social media strategy, you schedule your tweets, you can write them all up on a Monday morning, you press go and they'll come out and it'll be perfectly fine. But there's the difference between that kind of broadcasting and that engagement and conversation. I sometimes go on Twitter and I think, I have one thing to say, so I'll just nip on and just say that, and I won't really look at it for the rest of the day, and then look up an hour and a half later in the midst of four different conversations.
That's definitely right. It can really eat your day away. So it's one of those. It's a difficult. I find it. There are times where you think that you possibly just, for your own personal Twitter, you have to switch it off and not look at it. So, but if you've got that as part of your job, then for what we do in our team is, I personally do far less and less and less, and it's shared amongst the whole team. And we have diaries where people are actually kind of scheduled on to be watching and replying for that purpose. It's a difficult. I think. What I would say is it's far easier to tweet as a person than it is as an institution. I would say that's probably my kind of one of the realizations over time. And I wonder whether I contribute far more tweets to my own Twitter now than I do to our institutional one. Partly because of that, because you can put in as much as you want, and it's slightly less kind of timetable. You see what?
I think it's really good though to hear about the differences between the personal and the institutional Twitter role. And I know that's one that many academics, whether it's also tweeting for a project or also tweeting for a department, or also tweeting for an institution, it's a line that a lot of people find themselves having to walk, and then you have to kind of compartmentalize your engagement and your voices, as you say. So that's
yeah,
really, really great to bring in. And you mentioned the
yeah,
fact, and I think one of the things I wanted to talk about on the institutional side is that you work kind of as part of a team. So this very much at Glasgow is something where there's multiple contributors.
hmm,
And one area where that seems clear to me, looking at the special collections material online, is in the use of blogs. So you're
yeah.
kind of still creating and publicizing blog content based on special collections material. And for anyone watching this, these are really fantastic, and I really, really recommend them. Some fantastic recent stuff. I wondered if you could talk a bit about, is it all the same sets of concerns in terms of blogging special collections materials, or are there other things that people would want to be aware of if this was what they wanted to do as an institution?
Yeah, I think this is it's an interesting one, blogs, because some of the same questions come up there. So I suppose it's about investment against reward. You can definitely you can see, you know, engagement in a tweet by the number of retweets. You can look at engagement in WordPress for the number of retweets, yes, but also the number of views something has had. And what you will sometimes find is that things don't necessarily get the number of views that you would like, given how much work goes into them. so so blogs are a really strange one, but what they're particularly useful for, I find, is recording a little bit of research that you've done, or see something that's come up through an inquiry about one of your items that you wouldn't necessarily know where to keep otherwise. And so you can keep it all in one place there, and you can return to it later on. So I find I use them partly almost as um, uh, um, almost like an ancillary to a catalogue record, I suppose, and that they're recording that kind of information that doesn't quite fit within a catalogue. It's not big enough to be an article or something like that, a journal article, but it's a little bit of useful information. They're time consuming if you were to think about them as start to end, what's involved in researching and writing them all. But in fact, a lot of that has been done anyway, because it's usually come about through another activity, and that's probably that's where these things are really, really useful. Probably both blogs and tweets can be secondary to another activity from that point of view. So it's then just about having that time to actually write them up. Um, yeah.
I think in some ways it reflects how many researchers use blogs as well, as for, the stuff that doesn't quite fit
Bit.
into maybe the chapter you're
Footnotes.
writing or the essay you're writing, but the bits that you found in the archive and you think, oh, actually I need to, but also, as you say, you can come back to them, right? So you find something that sets a thought process going, you
Yeah.
kind of pin that in the form of a short post, and it might be the kind of thing that you return to in much more detail
Yeah.
as time goes on.
Yeah.
I really love what you have to say about the relationship between that kind of blogging and the catalog. I'd never thought of that as the idea that the stuff that doesn't fit the form of the catalog that you can kind of put somewhere else and keep accessible.
I've Catalogs are a whole thing that I'm interested in. Cataloging. I started as a cataloger, and it's something again that when I get grumpy, it's underfunded. No one seems to actually recognise how important it is. And catalog interfaces, I think, both as librarians and researchers, get hugely frustrated by lots of search interfaces, but they're they are the single point of truth when it comes to what you know about an item. So they're hugely important to be maintained and understood. But the structures of them, are quite strict in what goes in, what recorded in there, and how it gets recorded. I think that will actually change over the next number of years. I think people are really looking hard about what a catalogue actually is and what kind of information can be contained within it. But we're not there yet. And so blogs have that interesting function where you could potentially then link that blog to your catalogue records. That somebody comes into the catalogue and, oh, a little more link on that, and it links you out to the blog. So there's an interesting kind of complementarity to, I find, at the moment.
I think it makes me think of, as I'm an early modern historian myself, and I know that any early modernist I know kind of, um, obviously we all use catalogs, but we're conscious that kind of the greatest finding aid there is the brain of the archivists and librarians in the special collections that you're working on,
Yeah.
because in the archive you're working on, because there's so much more, as you say, that doesn't fit.
No.
And being able, it strikes me that, with something like blogging, it allows, for people who aren't necessarily in the room at the time, or at an early stage of their research, it allows them to plug in a little more to that incredible amount of knowledge which is there in the room, but doesn't always, as you say, fit neatly into cataloging, or as you say, is not well funded enough to fit yet into a catalog,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
another concern as well. Am I right in thinking that with the blogs as well, that you'll often commission blogs, or have researchers write blogs as well, so people will kind of
Yeah.
write about things that they've been working on in collections as well?
Yeah, that's so one of the things. Are lots of other research libraries over the last few years. We've developed a research fellow program where we have funds available for travel and accommodation for early career researchers to engage and use our collections for a period of time. So what we've been each of them to do more recently is then contribute a blog post about their research, what they've been doing with our collection. So that's one good kind of steady stream, if you like, of material. But we've also then slightly more ad hoc approach. If you're talking to a researcher and you think what they're doing is interesting, you could maybe suggest that they write something up, or co-write something with you to try and frame things. I mean, as I talk blogs here, I realise that if anything, I think blogs are far more effective and better than Twitter for any of this stuff. But I do far less of it than I've ever done before, because of other things going on. And I think it's a real shame, because I think that there are really interesting length of work. You don't need to do quite as much as you would for, say, like a journal article or something like that. You can just jot down formed ideas, ask people to contribute. What am I looking at here? Does anyone else know anything about this? So they're really.
I think they're a great way of, as you say, kind of collating knowledge from different sources, and kind of getting it on the page. Another method that I found is really, really good is ringing people on Zoom and making them tell you everything they know. So with that, Bob, I mean, I don't want to keep you all day. I don't know if there's any topics you feel we didn't cover, or anything you wanted to add in conclusion. This has been really, really useful, I think.
No, I was saying, it's funny you should mention Zoom at the end, because I think, well, one of the things it really needs addressing when it comes to social media is the 2020 has been such a difficult year for everyone, and it's been such a change in behaviour. I think social media is a really tiring and difficult place to be a lot of the time. There's we've coined doom scrolling now for this. So what I would say, I've been kind of very positive about all of, I would say, my experiences with things like social media generally, but I'm fully aware that of the privileges that I have as a white kind of middle class guy using this sort of content. It can be quite noxious, dangerous, and unpleasant, and for people to use that depending on their situation. So that's one of the things just to be bearing in mind. And institutionally, I think it's quite important that when institutions have maybe people of lower grades who are contributing to their Twitter, that they're properly supported, because it can quickly, something being framed in the wrong way or said quickly can lead to a kind of Twitter pile on. So these are things that I think we as heritage institutions are still trying to properly work out how to do that better than we have been so far. So that's something to be worked on. And quickly, just before is on Zoom, another thing to be thinking about is probably like video, where additional content. So you're talking about speaking to people and getting information from them. Again, kind of ancillaries to catalogs and useful ways of recording information. Are we using a little bit more, little videos of objects talking about things, framing up ways that we can two things.
It's actually a really good point, though. And thinking about it's something that I've been conscious of in dealing with. So I work at the University of Leeds, and the brilliant team at the Special Collections and Brotherton Library have been doing great stuff with visualizers, and thinking a bit about how that's going to shape student engagement and public engagement with special collections materials in future is going to be really exciting. And you've just given me a great idea for another video. So thank you very much for that, Bob. And Bob, I want to thank you so much. We're going to include links to your own Twitter, to the Glasgow Special Collections Twitter, and of course to the wonderful blogs hosted by Special Collections at the University of Glasgow. But thanks so much for making the time. It was great to talk to you.
No problem. Thanks, John. Nice to see you.
You too.
Cheers.